Please continue with your lunch and your dessert, but we really do want to give Professor Powell enough time for his presentation. And welcome everybody to another packed house at the Economic Club. I'm Birgit Kloos, CEO of The Right Place and a former chair of the Economic Club. And I'm thrilled to see so many of you in the room. And as many of you do in this room, I often have the opportunity to network with newcomers to the community, and I always mention this club as the place to rub shoulders with your peers. So for those of you who are guests today, let me invite you to become members. It's really a tremendous bargain, if you will. You meet the business community of West Michigan, and always have a phenomenal program, and today is really no different. Before we get started with our speaker, may I remind everybody to silence your cell phones, although tweeting how terrific this program is okay. I'd like to remind you that the next meeting is on the 23rd of February, and the speaker will be Tom Donahue, the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the topic is Trade, America's Next Great Success Story. And I've heard him speak. He's an outstanding speaker. And I also want to thank K-Connect for Pam Perriott, who's at our speaker's table today, for being the co-sponsor of this meeting today. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Fred Keller, the chairman of Cascade Engineering, a former chair and who really needs no introduction. Fred?
Thank you, Birgit, and thank you all for being here for this very important subject today. This is, as Birgit mentioned, sponsored by not only the Econ Club, but the K-Connect and Talent 2025. The Talent 2025 is our 13-county CEO-led effort to make sure that we've got top 20 global talent in this region to continue our growth. And K-Connect is our Kent County collective impact effort to assure the best outcomes for all of our children, our youth, our young adults in this county. Both of these initiatives have diversity and inclusion working groups to ensure that their work benefits all who live in our communities. These work groups will also capture a little bit more of Dr. Powell's time at 2 o'clock this afternoon with a session for the purpose of detailing the next chapter of West Michigan's inclusive growth journey. And a huge thank you, of course, to the Econ Club for capitalizing on this, seizing on this opportunity to bring this important topic to the business community and to their membership. It's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. John Powell back to Grand Rapids. He's been here before. He's born in Detroit, kind of a Midwestern roots, and for a while was at this certain university to the south with red and gray in their colors, where he led the Kirwan Institute for the study of race and ethnicity. But John has recently returned to the place where he received his Ph.D., UC Berkeley, where he leads the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society and holds the Professor of Law and the Professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies. Dr. Powell has taught at the Columbia and Harvard Law Schools, to drop a few names, and has also spent his career in research, and really has spent his career in research around diversity, inclusion, inadvertent racism, and how these impact our society. And I can tell you that after having heard Dr. Powell on several occasions, that his work is not only insightful, it's logical, sensitive, and welcoming. And by the way, don't forget to pick up one of his most recent books, or his most recent book, not one of his, but is the most recent book. There is in the back, and he'll be happy to sign those as well for you afterwards. Allow me to take just a few seconds to frame the issue for West Michigan a little bit, maybe be a little provocative. But the question I think that lingers is, why worry about equity? Why worry about racial equity? For goodness sakes, we're not of Ferguson, Missouri. But maybe not, but they didn't think they were either. On the positive side, we are a community with good intentions, tremendous intentions, good philanthropic heart. We've been recognized nationally, and over the last couple of decades, we've started with starting with the Institutes for Healing of Racism that was initiated by business leader Bob Woodrick back in the 90s. We've worked to improve our knowledge, our attitudes, and our behaviors with regard to inclusion. Today, we have businesses and organizations from the Lakeshore to downtown Grand Rapids committed to addressing racism, diversity, and inclusion. And we've got our not-so-good sides. You know, it's worth reminding ourselves, especially for those of you who are not old enough to have lived through it, but in my lifetime, there were legal restrictions on who could live where, fostered by national guidelines about separate but equal. Legal redlining existed in Grand Rapids until 1968, and practices persisted well beyond that time, where people were inhibited from where they could live simply by the color of their skin. The most recent Forbes article has reported Grand Rapids as 51st out of 52 communities studied with regard to how well African Americans are doing economically. And another report followed showing how Hispanics were faring here as well. Not so good. We don't intend to be like what the statistics would say, but I think you would agree we need to improve, if for no other reason, for West Michigan to be the best place to attract talent to continue our growth. We have a real and present opportunity for us to improve our community. One thing seems clear to me in the work we do within our own companies and organizations. We need to create safe spaces for this dialogue to continue beyond today. This is not a zero-sum game where one person wins and another loses. On the contrary, everyone benefits. And Dr. Powell, by providing his perspective and examples based on research, is just the right catalyst to help us move to the next level. Would you welcome Dr. John Powell to Grand Rapids?
Thank you, Fred, and thank all of you. Many of you I've met before, and some of you I'm meeting for the first time, but it's a delight to be here. And just in preparing to come here, read about all the tremendous things that are happening in this part of the world. As Fred said, I'm from Detroit, grew up and went to high school there, and then wandered out west and haven't been living back in this area for most of my adult life, except for that brief spin of time I spent down in that other state that has a pretty good football team. So I have a PowerPoint, and as a friend of mine often say, you only need two things when you have a PowerPoint, and that's power and a point. I hope I have at least one of them. I'm probably not going to get through the entire PowerPoint. It's too long, but I'd like to think of it as a reference that you could use going forward. I also wanted to see if it's feasible to actually have some time to have a conversation with you if there's time. I know we have a hard stop at 1:30. So I'm going to talk about a number of things. The challenge, there's the data, there is what you need to move forward, and then there's execution and evaluation. Some of you have already been exposed to. I know a good friend of mine, Emmanuel Pastor, was here a few months ago. I actually called him a couple of days ago and said, so how was your experience? He said it was phenomenal, had a good experience. So I'm going to touch on some of the same data, but not go into it in great detail. His presentation is online, and I'm sure you can look at it at your leisure. But I do think it's important to sort of basically say, what is the opportunity and challenge? Why are we here? And maybe there's not a problem. Maybe we're here because they serve really good lunch. Mine was pretty good. But I think it's actually deeper than that. And I think both the country and Grand Rapids is going through some phenomenal changes that it's really important to try to understand. So one of the ways of understanding the change is that our ability to engage in collective action is actually being challenged. The most extreme, of course, is government itself, where we basically oftentimes adopt a mantra that government can't do anything, or if it does something, it does it wrong. And we extend that to collective action. I want to suggest to you that almost any problem that we're addressing today, either in Michigan, the country, or the world, cannot be effectively addressed without collective action. And so it's not saying that collective action always is easy. It's not saying we always do it right. But I'm suggesting that many of the big problems we're facing today simply cannot be addressed without collective action. But I want to go one step further. Part of the challenge to a collective action is not just the lack of efficiency. What I want to suggest to you is that the attack on government, and by extension, attack on collective action, actually has a genesis. It actually comes out of fear of the other. And I have some charts I'll show you in a little bit in terms of polarization in the United States. That to some extent, the polarization is a response to the civil rights movement itself. So I say if the vehicle of attack on collective action is a car, then the fuel is the fear of the other. And that one of the ways that we sort of address the fear of the other is start by attacking collective action. And I'll come back with some more data with that later. So like Grand Rapids and like the country, maybe more in the country, we live in a deeply divided America. And again, this divide is relatively recent. And there's a book called Deeply Divided that actually chronicles how the country has reached this point of a deep divide. And again, I want to suggest that not always explicitly, but that race plays a very important role in terms of understanding this divide in the country, even though it takes on different forms. So when I say race, I'm not talking about simply disparities between whites and people of color. That the fear of the racial other, the fear of the other, actually affects the design and structure of both our economy and our politics. That affects all of us. So that's really the message. That, and there's a book by Ira Katznelson called Fear Itself. And he talks about how fear, going back to the New Deal, structured the modern economy in a way that's somewhat surprising. So today we know that there is a lot of turmoil around the economy, and there's huge economic inequality. Again, I would suggest that before the economic equality, before the economic, if you will, polarization, there was political polarization. So in a sense, as we move to fix the economy, we need to move to fix the political polarization. And as I already suggested, the political polarization, which we used to call the Southern strategy, was a response to the civil rights movement. So there's a particular issue around this. Now, there's huge inequality, and one question that I think you have to ask is, when does inequality become a problem? I don't think anyone is saying we should have absolute equality. And yet, at some point, a number of writers suggest that inequality becomes a problem. So at what point does inequality become a problem? And what do we mean by inequality? We could talk about income inequality. We could talk about inequality in schools. We could talk about wealth inequality. And one way, and that there's a large consensus on, is political inequality. When political inequality starts to become the norm, then that's a problem. So there's a way of talking about inequality and looking at how inequality in one area, economic inequality, affects inequality in another area, political inequality. And again, you can't understand this without understanding the role of race. And I cite here, and I know many of you may have trouble reading this, but Paul Krugman makes up argument that you can't understand the U.S. economy without understanding the role of race. So one of the things I try to do is to broaden our understanding of race, because oftentimes we think of race, we think of racism, we think of what's happening to black people, what's happening to Latino and Asians, maybe Native Americans, but we don't think about the economy. We don't think about the structure of our society. And what Krugman and others are saying is that you can't understand the U.S. economy without understanding race. And of course, we all live in the U.S. economy, not just people of color. Sometimes we think we'll be rescued by demographics. The country is becoming more diverse, and it's actually happening quite fast. And as the country becomes more diverse, we think, well, many of these issues will go away. We also think, well, younger people, they don't have the same racial attitudes as older people, so maybe after some of us older people die, the problem will fix itself. And not that I'm against dying, but everything that we know suggests that that's actually not right. These are really complex issues. They get lodged into our structures. And I remember growing up in the 60s that there was a period of time that we thought all the problems that the world faced would be fixed by the time those of us coming of age in the 60s became real adults. Here we are. So demographics themselves will not save us. We actually have to look at structures, we have to look at methods, we have to look at what we're doing. And when we look at what we're doing, we're actually seeing that we're structuring the reproduction of this problem only in an accelerated way. So don't wait for demographics to address this. I'm going to just look at some data very quickly. This is data in terms of growth. We see that this is for the Grand Rapids area. We see that the white population is not growing. The black population is growing small and a rapid growth in terms of Latinos and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So all the growth, and growth is basically a good thing. Population growth is a good thing. One slide I don't have up here that I'd like to share with you, which I think is fascinating. So who do you think, as a group, what group is the fastest growing group in the United States? And my guess is it's probably growing relatively fast in Grand Rapids as well. So just shout it out if you know. Latinos, okay. Close, but no cigar. The fastest growing group in the United States is multiracial groups. The 15% of marriages today in the United States are between people of different racial ethnic groups. In 10 years, that number is supposed to be 25%. 25%. 40% of families today, 40% of families have someone in their family of a different racial ethnic group. In 10 years, it will be 60%. So there's something going on in the country that's quite phenomenal. And it's largely unnoticed because that group is not a political group. And I think one of their first political acts was the Cheerio commercial that some of you may have seen, where they have an interracial couple on a Cheerio commercial. And some people didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that on mainstream television they had an interracial couple. Well, that's the future that we're actually going to. And how we address that future becomes quite important. But it's not just looking at populations, it's also looking at how different populations are doing. And Gail sent me a lot of good material prepared for my talk, and Fred just talked about things. When you look at how blacks and Latinos are doing, they're not doing that well in Grand Rapids. And the obvious question is why? Grand Rapids seems to be, as they say, a good place to live, maybe, if you're white and if you don't mind snow. And I'm not white and I don't like snow. But if you're black and Latino, it's actually, there's some issues. Now you might say, well, then, stay away. But the reality is the health of your region. Again, if you go back to the earlier chart in terms of growth, in terms of population, the white community is not growing. In fact, the white community is declining. So if you don't attract other people, it means just in terms of population, you will not be a thriving community. Now, so you have blacks and Latinos and Asian Americans and others come here, but if they're coming here and they're not thriving themselves, that's the future of Grand Rapids. Plain and simple. It's not that you have to like them. It's not morally that this is the great thing to do. If you look at population trends, if you don't have the younger people coming up well-educated and ready to step into your roles, then it means our future is problematic. If you look in terms of educational attainment, one reason the demographics won't save us, the gap between college graduate for blacks and whites and Latinos is huge. Again, Latinos, fastest growing population here, only 10% with a college degree, whereas 34% of whites, which means that disparity is baked into our education system, because then that will be reflected in the workforce and will be reflected in the business and economic system. But remember, whites are in decline, Latinos are growing. We're not educating them. No one would say we could have a thriving economic system where only 10% of the population was educated. And yet that's structurally what we're doing right now. Everyone has, not everyone, but a lot of people have heard of Piketty's new book called Capital in the 21st Century. The New York Times called it the most important economic book probably since Marx and Adam Smith. One of the things he shows is that inequality in terms of wealth is more important than inequality in terms of income. And the wealth inequality in the United States is accelerating. And the acceleration goes back to, you might have guessed it, the 1970s. So again, not calling for complete equality, but the extreme inequality that we're seeing in the United States is a function of something that happened in the 1970s. Now, some people will explain this inequality in terms of technology and globalization. Close but no cigar. We don't, when you look at our sister country, Canada, same technology, same world, not nearly this extreme inequality that we have. So there's something going on that is baked into our water, baked into our system, that's not happening in the rest of the world. We also see that the middle class, and when I say the middle class, I mean the middle class. I don't mean blacks and Latinos, I mean everybody. The middle class is not only declining in the United States, but how it holds its assets is also becoming problematic. So we're becoming more diverse, but we're becoming more stratified, both in terms of income and in terms of wealth as a country. So this is a chart that may be hard to read, but basically it looks at economic and political polarization and the rise of each. And really what it shows, I'll interpret it for you, is that the political polarization precedes the economic polarization. And again, going back to the 1970s. So, as I suggested, what was going on in the 1970s? It was a political realignment, and it was an adjustment to the civil rights movement. So we're still living, we're still fighting the civil rights movement, but at a different level. We're fighting it in terms of the economy and in terms of politics. This is another one showing the increased political polarization. Now, interestingly enough, this shows individual polarization. Now, if you compare this chart to the other two, you see that individual polarization is actually not that much higher today than it was 30 years ago, which is surprising, because you might think, well, the country's moved to the right, so that's what's, and part of the country's moved to the left, and then we have this tremendous political polarization. Turns out it's not true. It's not that people, individuals, are more polarized, it's that the country is more polarized, politically and institutionally and structurally. And sometimes we conflate individual behavior, individual attitudes, with institutional and structural behavior. They're not the same. They don't mimic each other. And it's not the same all over the country. So one of the things we know is that in terms of economic polarization, which is partially measured in terms of upward mobility, there's some structural things that make economic polarization more pronounced. And one of them, of course, is segregation. Another is a high number of African Americans, which also tends to increase the possibility of segregation, inequality in the schools, and social capital and networks, which I'll say more about later. So think about the way the structures actually can marginalize us. The obvious way is that structures don't give us access. There are certain structures that actually keep certain people from performing and allows others to perform. What I want to suggest to you is that structures are never neutral. Structures are always doing work, and they do work better for some than for others, and largely in a way that we miss. Let me give you an example. Think about the explosion of work and the middle class in the 1930s and 40s. We had the New Deal, then we had the Marshall Plan. That's when the modern middle class in America was born. That's when the modern wealth accumulation in America started happening. And it happened largely as a result of some serious structural changes in the New Deal and then in the Marshall Plan. But the way that structure was put in place had huge implications in terms of who benefited and who did not benefit. And you can have, there are just hundreds of examples, but I'll give you a couple. Think of the way we define work. Now you might think work is just work, but no, we define work as, there's certain things that counted as work and therefore was covered. There were certain things that was defined as not work and it was not covered. So what was defined as not work? Well, if you worked in agriculture, not work. If you stayed home and took care of your kids, not work. If you're a domestic servant, not work. All the Social Security benefits that flowed from the change in our system didn't cover those three areas. Now, who actually populated those three areas? Blacks, Latinos, and women. So we had a system that structured benefits for certain groups and structured the lack of benefits for another group. Let me stick on Social Security for a minute. You may say, well, some of those things have been corrected. This one has not been corrected. In terms of formal work, so you get pension and Social Security, you have to work 40 quarters, and then you get Social Security benefits. Not a lot, but you get them. It turns out men are much more likely to qualify for those benefits. But then Social Security goes on further to say, if you're married, and if you've been married for a certain period of time, your partner can get those benefits as well, and certainly if you die. But it says, if you die, your partner gets the benefits, and your partner remarries, your partner loses the benefits. Now, this is a long story, but think about this. So men are more likely to get the benefits. Who is more likely to die first in a relationship? Men. And so now we have a woman, a widow, who can get benefits for her husband, provided she doesn't go out and marry some other person. So we're saying you can get the benefits from your husband, but if you remarry, you can't get the benefits. And most 65 and 70-year-old women don't believe in cohabitation. So the whole structure, and this is in place today, not last year, not 20 years ago. This is how our Social Security system works today. It's gendered. It disadvantaged women. And you can bet a dime to a donut that the people who put this in place were largely men. And it's like, well, if she marries somebody else, forget her, you know. There are different ways in which we organize our sense of well-being. And here at the Economic Club, obviously, it's not surprising that one of them is the economy. So how much stuff do we have? Is the economy growing? And this is the way we measure how things are going. Another, of course, is politics. We have a sense of political being. Can we influence rules that actually affects our economy? These things are interrelated, but not the same. And then the third area is what I call ontological, or a sense of being. Do we feel good about ourselves collectively? Do we feel that our lives has meaning to it? And what I want to suggest is that we tend to focus on these first two. Do we have enough stuff? Do we have influence over our lives politically? We tend not to focus on the third. When I say we, I mean people who are engaged in issues around social justice. I want to suggest that in some ways, the most important thing that we're struggling with right now is this third area as to who we are. Who are we collectively? And one way of thinking about this is who belongs? Who's in your tribe? Who's in your community? Who do you have empathy for? And as some of you may know, we're having a conference in April, you're all invited. It's called Othering and Belonging. The way that we extend the sense of belonging to people, and it's not just a psychological thing, it's also economic, it's also structural. If you have someone in a wheelchair and they're trying to come to this meeting and there's no elevator, they don't belong. They can't get here. So our structures say to people whether or not you belong. We also can say to people, you don't belong. We other people. We do this consciously, unconsciously, structurally, culturally, and it turns out to be incredibly important in terms of well-being. Well, we looked at some data earlier about changing demographics. As it turns out, as the country becomes more diverse, there's very strong empirical evidence that a large swath of America becomes anxious. So we may think diversity is a good thing, and we may even celebrate it at a conscious level, but at an unconscious level, many of us feel anxious. And the anxiety actually affects our sense of who belong. Who are those people coming to our country? And it can happen along racial lines. It can happen along religious lines. It can happen along sexual orientation. So there's a sense in which we say these people coming are somehow challenging not necessarily what we have, but who we are. The fight around gay marriage, that somehow if we allow gay people to get married, it's going to affect what? My ability to get married if I want to marry someone who's heterosexual? It's not taking from me in a material sense, but it's challenging me in the ontological sense. And this is what many of the fights are about today. And much of this happens at the unconscious level, and we can measure it. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the unconscious and then quickly skip over some slides and skip toward the end. So the unconscious and the conscious. The conscious process about 40 bits of information a second, 40. During that same second, your unconscious is processing around 11 million bits of information. So if you really want to know what's going on, you could ask the 40, or you could ask the 11 million. We really need to get access to the unconscious, and we can't get direct access. It has to be indirect. And the process of othering happens largely through the unconscious. But then it gets manifested in hundreds of ways: structures, culture, systems, networks. And they're going to show us something, because we couldn't get this to show from my computer. This is a cue for the people up in the booth.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
Okay, so the reason I show this, because when I talk about the unconscious, and there's the whole thing I do around the unconscious, but when I talk about the unconscious, it's hard to believe that I don't know what's going on in my mind. And since we only process 40 bits of information a second consciously, we have, to some extent, we can be primed to see certain things, which means we don't see other things. You were primed in this video. There were two primes, counting, team in white. So you're counting the ball, and you're looking for the team in white. That, you just exhausted your 40. Anything else that happens, your unconscious actually sees and actually processes, but you don't notice it consciously. We're primed all the time. We're primed in terms of race. We're primed in terms of gender. We're primed in terms of disabilities. We're primed to notice certain things and not notice certain things. And we're primed to make meaning around those things. And so those things affect us. So I always say, if you want to know someone's weight, give them a scale. Because most of us don't know our weight, and if we did know, we don't want to tell it. So if you want to know what's going on in the unconscious, you have to actually measure it. So you have some way of sort of seeing what's going on. Now, there's certain things that indicate that things are going on. It doesn't prove it. So for example, if we have a group of 1,000 people, and there's one woman and 999 men, we say, there's probably something that's filtering women out. Oh, so then everyone, the men would stand up and say, no, no, no. We had an invitation, and everybody could come. We announced it at the Super Bowl, right? And the filtering happened through the Super Bowl, right? It's like, okay, so you have these mechanisms that actually reproduce themselves, not through any intent. And so we have to look at outcomes to see maybe, as an investigation, something is going on. And there are hundreds of examples like this. I'll just give you one other. You may know of this. There was a period of time when almost no woman was in a professional orchestra. And we had stories about this. Well, you know, women, they have to do other things. They like knitting, they like sewing. If they play instruments, they're just not as good as men because they don't have time. And then somebody had the idea, what if we had auditions for orchestras where you couldn't see who was actually playing? Now, of course, the people who were selecting who was going to be in the orchestra weren't saying, oh, there's a woman, I don't want her in my orchestra. In fact, they would have categorically denied that gender had anything to do with their evaluation. But when they had blind tests, the number of women in orchestras shot up to about 25%. When you couldn't see who was playing, all of a sudden, women could play better. So the number shot up to 25%. Someone then had another idea. What if you not only couldn't see who was playing, but you couldn't hear the person walking onto the stage? Because the unconscious was processing the footsteps. And it's like high heels, woman, not in the orchestra. And so then the numbers went up to 40%. So this actually filtering out women was happening at an unconscious level, and people figured out interventions that largely corrected that. I want to suggest that we're doing that all the time. And I'm not suggesting that one group is doing it, I'm suggesting that all groups are doing it. And we do it largely based on who belongs and who's other. We filter out others, and we actually embrace those who already belong. And all of this is done at the implicit level. So the fact that we other is not negative in and of itself. It's a human process, but it is a process that affects and undermines sometimes our core values. As Benjamin Franklin says, we tend to hate people that we treat badly and like people that we treat well. And again, although Benjamin Franklin was not a psychologist, it turns out that's true. When you treat people well, you tend to like them. It's not that you like them and therefore you treat them well. You treat them well and then you like them. So the process of othering is quite profound. And when I was talking to people on the phone in preparation for today, I mentioned othering is not simply about race. It's about everything. It's about everything. And when you're other, you recognize it, and the group, you become also stereotyped. You get noticed but not seen. Now, if you think about it, all of us can think about places where we landed and we felt othered. I have a friend who does work, he's my age, does work in Silicon Valley. He goes down to Google, he's 60-something years old, and he's all of a sudden, he's looking around the room to see if there's anybody else over 40, right? One of the things you do when you're othered is you count. Oh, hey, another guy with no hair, right? And you can other on anything. And sometimes it's a small thing, and sometimes it's a large thing. And when we are normally represented in the majority, we don't recognize the stress it puts on people who are constantly in the minority. They're constantly othered. What's the big deal? So what? I don't care if there's another man in the room or not. Turns out the unconscious does care. And we actually then can do this not only at a personal level, but at an institutional level as well. And sometimes I forget this. I just gave a speech at Berkeley where I teach, and I give speeches a lot. And one of the junior professors and students came up to me afterwards, and the student in particular, Ph.D. student, grade school, he said, Professor Powell, that was so wonderful. He said, it brought me to tears. And I think I'm pretty good, but bring him to tears? I said, it's like, are you emotional? What's going on? And he said, I so seldom see an African-American professor in this role. He said, I can't tell you how important it was to me. And I said, okay, I believe you. So here's some data on how we respond to our society becoming more diverse. And the blue represents the conscious response. The red represents the unconscious response. So in every case, people say, what do you think about diversity? Oh, it's great. And the unconscious is like, wow, I can't believe it. Went to Walmart, or went to Target, and no one spoke English. It didn't feel good. And so it happens all across the board. Another way of thinking about it is, this is called the social cognition test. And this is an empirical test. It's how much we like a group and how competent that we think they are. And the group that's really competent and I like a lot, that's my group. My group is smart and I like them. Now somebody else's group, there's some groups that are smart and I don't like them. Now this is empirical. So for example, at a national level, we tend to think Asian Americans are smart. We don't like them though. We don't think, it's like, oh, they don't have any soul, About 2 years ago, I think it was Newsweek found a woman in China that was beautiful. And it's like, China comes up with a beautiful woman. Really? In 2013? You don't think anyway, the point is that we were filtering. And you might imagine the Chinese woman that was beautiful in 2013 had a lot of features that looked like European features. That's what made her beautiful. There's also groups that we don't like and we think they're not very smart. And when groups fall way into that category, we other them at the extreme. When we see someone of the same species, there's a part of the brain that lights up. We are wired to recognize fellow species. When we extremely other someone, that part of the brain does not light up. We literally, at an unconscious level, don't see certain people as human. And when you don't see people as human, you're not going to invite them to your club, your house. You're going to filter them out. And so part of it is to understand that process and begin to change it. Here's a concrete example of that. At UT Austin, great school, not as good as Michigan or Berkeley, but still a great school. They have a lot of Black and Latino students, and they weren't doing well. And the story was, well, UT Austin is hard, and these students went to bad schools, and they're not prepared, and let's give them a remedial program so they could do better. And they spent a lot of money, had a remedial program, and the numbers barely moved. And this is a story that in the New York Times where this young Black woman went to UT Austin. This was her dream to go to this school. And she got there, and she was not performing. And even her mother was saying, maybe it's just too hard, hon. Maybe you should go to another school. And long and short of it, a professor pulled some of these students together and started talking about what does it feel like to be at UT Austin and be Black? What does it feel like to be at UT Austin and be Latino? And just as an example, I was recruited by UT Austin, and they were saying, this is a great school, and I actually loved it. I like Austin, I like the school, but they're saying, you know, don't be put off by all the Confederate memorabilia around campus. You know, this is still a warming, loving place. And there are other examples of that. I was recruited by University of Georgia, and they took me up to Stone Mountain. I don't know if you've been there. It's a Confederate theme park. And I mean, I kid you not. And these were people who were trying to recruit me. And they were crying as Robert E. Lee was riding across on this, and I'm thinking, what the hell am I? Needless to say, I didn't go to, but my point is, when they changed and actually started addressing their sense of not belonging, the black students and Latino students started graduating at almost exactly the same rate as the white students. It wasn't lack of capacity. It wasn't lack of training. It was lack of belonging. And so this is actually quite robust. And the research was so powerful that people thought it was cooked. So we have what I call the circle of human concern. And there are things we can do to make sure people are in the circle. I want to get to a few things that you might do, and then I'm going to end because I think we're almost out of time. Where are we, Pam? 5 minutes? Well, okay, possibility to moving forward in 5 minutes. First of all, we have this, plus Q&A, okay, great. We have this thing called the Local and Regional Government Alliance on Racial Equity, which is a mouthful. But basically, we actually are working with governments and other groups in terms of coming up with concrete suggestions for moving forward. We have about 15 governmental entities involved. This work comes out of Seattle, and some of it's quite concrete and robust, all the way from things like procurement, racial equity tools, looking at socially driven investment for pension funds, creating networks. And there's one example I want to give you. All these are concrete examples. Oh, here's one I want to get to. So here's one in Cleveland, Portland. So I have it on presenter's view, so I can look at the next slide. So Cleveland is the next slide. This is a project I worked on. We saw in Cleveland that black businesses and Latino businesses grew at the same rate of white businesses for the first 6 years, and then they stopped growing. And no one could figure out why. And they said, maybe it's because of discrimination. And so they brought me in and some others, and they said, we already know what the problem is, but we just want you to document it. It's discrimination. And I said, well, discrimination didn't exist in the first 5 or 6 years? And there were some people who were hostile to have my being there. It's like, why do we need a college professor to come in and tell us this stuff? You know, and I said, well, you know, maybe it was a bad idea, but since I'm here, let's work together. It turned out that what was going on is that after 5 or 6 years, you needed not debt investment, you needed equity investment. And equity investment was largely driven by networks. And that blacks and Latinos had a different set of networks, and they couldn't get equity. And no one had noticed that. And so networks is one of the messages I want to suggest to you. Networks are quite important. Sometimes networks are closed. That is, men will only network with other men, which means women will never get in those networks. And so you can actually map out your networks. And poor communities tend to have communities with a network with other poor people, which is great, except if you need money, or if you need power, or if you need resources. And so you literally can look at networks and how networks can reproduce unconsciously all the negative externalities that we're trying to address. So we've done this with looking at unions. Place and space matter. And in fact, you can think of a place as a network hub. So you think of things like where our schools are located. If we do local attendance zones for schools and localities are racially and economically segregated, it means we create different networks for students. And every educator will tell you, aside from the teacher, the most important learner for the other students are the other students. We learn from each other. So if you put all low-income students together, you actually create a negative drag on all the students that has nothing to do with the individual students. You actually know this, right? I mean, 83% of jobs are attained by word of mouth. So I say to my students, if you graduate from Berkeley with a 3.8 and your classmate does, and your classmate has a good network and you don't, she will get the job. Not because she's better prepared, not because she's working harder, but because she has better networks. And so one of the things to think about when I think about all the great entities that you have here working is how well are you networked? How well do you support each other? These are just other examples. You know, there's the thing of what they say, follow the money. So where's the money these days? Where's their growth? I'll end by just saying this. I know you have a lot of growth happening here in the region. There's a way of actually doing that growth so that it actually benefits. You have a thing called inclusive growth. There's actually a way of making that real, and without being immodest, I think we have the best platform in the country for doing that. You don't bring communities in. Berkeley is creating a new campus in Richmond, which is a poor area not far from Berkeley. They asked me to help the community with that effort so the community have some involvement. Berkeley is called the #1 public university in the world. They went out and hired all kinds of experts, not at Berkeley, but from around the world to help them build this new campus. Then they go to the community and say, we want you to comment on what we're doing. But the community has no capacity. And so the first thing I did is I said, we need to be able to hire soil engineers, water engineers, bond counselors, lawyers, architects, all for the community. And the university and the foundation that was supporting this said, why? We hired you. I'm not a soil engineer. There are decisions you have to make, but first you have to have the knowledge to make the decision. And so we created a different platform and a different set of relationship. And every major anchor institution, I think, needs to have this capacity if the community is going to actually effectively participate. And again, you're all invited to our conference. You can go on our website and see Othering and Belonging. And before you leave today, make sure you grab Racing to Justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking and mind-opening, I hope, presentation. And we do have some time for Q&A, so who has a question? Oh, come on, don't be shy. This is not usually a shy audience, so there has to be some questions for. So I'll ask, how do you overrule your unconscious?
You don't. So one of the things that we're finding, and this work around the unconscious is only about 30 years old, we can actually see the unconscious, we can measure it, but what you do is you put things in place to prime certain things. So the good news is most of us have conflicting things in terms of the unconscious. That is, for example, we want to be racially fair, and we have racial anxiety. Which one of those will be dominant? It depends on how they're primed. You can prime people to be racially anxious, or you can prime the same group to be racially inclusive. So part of it is there's a relationship between the unconscious and the structural. And this is, I didn't get into this, but the unconscious is actually social. It's actually reading the environment. So you actually create an environment that supports the kind of unconscious outcomes you want. But you can never overrule it. The conscious is much too small. And so if I'm giving this talk in the 1990s, I would say, if you don't want to be prejudiced, you have to really just consciously decide not to be prejudiced. Now, any neuropsychologist will tell you that's a fool's errand. The prejudice, or prejudging, or association, you can't get rid of it completely. But what you can do is manage it.
Yes, Paul. Paul?
Dr. Powell, we work with communities that are in a growth stage, business-wise development. Downtowns are rejuvenating themselves. How do you work with those communities to diversify their decision-making platforms, their planning platforms? How do you work with them to make sure there's inclusive growth for everyone to participate in that growth?
So I don't know if people around here heard, but basically the idea is how do you work with communities to make sure they can effectively participate in growth that's happening like in here downtown Grand Rapids. It's actually a very interesting process, and again, Berkeley is instructive. Excuse me. So when I went there to work with the community in Berkeley, they wanted to do a community benefits agreement, and they wanted to get jobs where they would make $15 an hour, and they wanted me to help them with that. And that's what they asked for. And so 2 points. First of all, and this may sound counterintuitive, but communities don't know what they want. Now, that may sound patronizing or elitist, but I want to go further. None of us do. And there's a book called Stumbling on Happiness by Gilbert from Harvard. And there's a term which you can Google called miswanting. It turns out that because wanting is largely a function of the conscious mind, we actually miswant. We think if I get X, it will deliver Y, and we get X, and it doesn't deliver Y. And we think, well, X wasn't quite the right X. So I'll get X plus 1, and we get X plus 1, and it doesn't deliver either. And actually what's going on is called miswanting. So what I say about communities is that communities are great at identifying their symptoms. They're not great at identifying what the cause is or what they want. But that's true for all of us. So when you go to a doctor and you say, I have chest pains, and I need some prescription Tums because I have gas. I ate something yesterday. If the doctor gives you prescription Tums and you go home that night and have a heart attack, your partner may have a lawsuit against the doctor. You asked for something, I want Tums, but that's not what you needed. What you needed was a thorough examination. My symptoms are gas, my symptoms, and then it turned out your arteries are completely blocked. So part of what we need to do with communities and with all of us, and we do this in business, is to make sure they have the type of capacity to allow them to identify really root causes and have appropriate ones. So what I did in Richmond is I said, look, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar project that's huge, a multi-billion-dollar project in a city that's only 100,000 people. And what you want out of that is a job? That's all? It's like, well, what else could we want? You could want, maybe you could have an equity interest. Maybe you could, when you do, maybe you get money when they issue the bonds. Maybe you could create a fund that actually would go to your community. Maybe you could create wealth. Maybe you could think about how would you actually build this university so it's not a fortress that keeps you outside. And this is the Bay Area. It's clear as this campus is built, the cost of housing in Richmond will explode, which means unless you create a structure in place, once they build this fabulous campus in Richmond, none of you will be able to afford to live there. So anyway, so helping them, giving them the expertise. And I'll just give you one last example. When I first talked to them, I said, let's get on the phone with a developer and have a developer talk about all the major development decisions and where you may intervene. And so I had a bunch of community people on the phone, the first time they ever talked to a developer. And I knew after the conversation they didn't understand most of the things the developer said. And I said, well, this developer is a friend of mine, and we can get somebody else, because they said, no, we love this guy, we love this guy. And it's not because they understood what he said, is they felt empowered. They had somebody working for them, helping them ask the right questions. So that's the kind of platform that I described, that creating real capacity for the community to participate in a real way. Most of the time when we ask the community to participate, there was an environmental impact statement done for this event, 300 pages. It was given to the community, and the community had 60 days to respond. 60 days to respond to a 300-page report full of technical terms. And they brought it to me, and they said, we need to respond. Can you respond to this? And I said, we need an environmental impact lawyer. They didn't have any money to hire a lawyer. And the clock was ticking. And literally, we ended up paying for it out of our own pocket because there had been no capacity for the community. And when the university gave this to the community, it wasn't trying to be, exclude them, but giving them a 300-page report of technical terms and then saying, you have a right to respond in 60 days. It was othering.
One more.
Great question. Two things I would say, or three things I would say. One, I'd say having that data begin with is important. And it may be uncomfortable, right? It's like I look in the mirror and it's like, God, I got a pimple. So I wish I hadn't looked in the mirror. But the pimple would still be there whether I looked in the mirror or not. So it's important to see where you are. And this is obviously a great place to live, but it's not serving all of this community well. It's important to know that. Then the second step is, what's driving that? So the data just is giving you, saying something is happening. It's not telling you why it's happening. And so you need to identify some mechanisms that actually is reproducing basically the negative career path for, or a life path for Black and Latino community. And be willing to actually then lean into and actually make changes. And the last thing I would say is to have a very clear goal, and you measure your success not by how many meetings you have, not by how many people come to your luncheon, by are you actually changing that outcome? As you move to actually change the outcome, you'll find there's some things in place that are simple to do, and there's some things in place that are, you know, sacred cows. It's like, well, we'd like to do this, but we can never do this because it affects something else over here that was really important to us. To be able to have that discussion and to find pathways. And I think, for example, we're talking to the city of New York right now. New York has a procurement of $19 billion a year. And its pension fund is $163 billion. And almost none of it goes to women or people of color. We could change that. I know, and we're working with New York to change it. And I say, I can't do the politics for you. I'll tell you there are going to be some politics. We can do it without cutting your return on your investment. But it means you're going to be working with an increasingly diverse group of people. Some people are going to feel like they're being cut out. There are going to be some politics behind it. But that's not hard to do from a policy perspective. It may be more tricky to do from a political perspective. So those are some of the things, and I already talked about networks. But I think, again, really diagnosing what's driving it and being clear about we're going to change that. We're going to invest. We're going to do whatever it takes to make that different.
Thank you. Thank you again, everybody, for coming, and Professor Powell for those really thought-provoking ideas, things that we can do in our community to move us up in the equity arena. And I want you to know that the Economic Club is donating a scholarship in your name to Junior Achievement, to a student at Junior Achievement. So thank you again for coming. And as I mentioned, the next meeting is in 2 weeks on February 23rd with Tom Donahue, and we hope to see you then. Thank you.